Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Tavio Akimasu. Welcome to our Implementation Science for Innovation and Discovery series. You've had probably attended some of the previous sessions where we started to discuss on related disciplines to translational science. And we had last month a session on design thinking. It was actually a more interactive seminar. But we had a few other sessions on quality improvement and systems engineering. We had another lecture. So today's lecture is entitled Human Factors Overview, a Key Perspective for Patient Safety Research and Operations. So you may ask yourself, and this was actually advertised with a little bit of description, what is human factors and how is that relevant to medicine or to healthcare in general? Well, you'll learn, hopefully today, that is a science of applying the understanding of human capabilities and limitations, cognitive, perceptual, behavioral, to investigating and supporting human performance in complex environments. And it offers a sociotechnical systems perspective and a set of methods to assess how humans interact in the workplace, in healthcare, and it goes beyond that, of course, in aviation and nuclear power and other complex domains. We are very lucky to have today Dr. Lisa Popotsky, who's a human factors scientist and an assistant professor in the Department of Biomedical and Health Information Sciences at University of Illinois in Chicago. And she's using mixed methods approaches, including naturalistic observations, cognitive task analysis, interviews, questionnaires, and experiments to characterize complex cognitive and behavioral work. She's using mostly social technical perspectives, I understand, but you'll hear more about that. Prior to coming to academia, she was working in different domains, ranging from healthcare, unmanned aerial vehicles, submarines, serious gaming, some of them funded by Department of Defense. And then she transitioned to academia to focus her research on applying human factors principles and approaches to improve patient safety and quality. So without further ado, welcome Dr. Popotsky.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me today. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for being here. Since we have this small, intimate group, which is quite nice, I'm going to try to make it kind of more casual than I planned. So feel free to chime in with questions, with any discussion topics, anything that comes to mind as I'm speaking. I understand we have an hour and a half, which is quite a bit of time. So yes. And for some reason, I thought that we might have a lot of trainees at this talk. So I did gear it sort of at a more basic level, which may or may not be appropriate. And if you want me to get a little bit more complicated, I'm absolutely willing to do so and unpack any areas that you have particular interest in. So thank you for the wonderful introduction. I'll just add just a little bit to my background. So I'm an assistant professor now at University of Illinois, Chicago. I'm in the Department of Biomedical.
This meeting is being recorded.
And Health Information Sciences. It's a little bit of an interesting department that we have because it's quite multidisciplinary department. And human factor science became a core competency of health informatics a number of years ago. So that's why I'm in that department. I'm not a health informatician, but human factors is core to health informatics. So that's why I'm there, and it makes sense. As part of our department, we used to have another human factor scientist. We have an MD researcher, and we have people of other backgrounds as well. So it's kind of a very exciting environment with multiple perspectives. Yes. So a little bit of an overview of what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about human factors first and foremost, and I'm going to take actually quite a bit of time to get there because one of my goals here is to kind of build a story that makes sense. And in hopes that you walk away with this idea that this is a perspective that's integral to the way that you see the world and the way that you see healthcare and the challenges that are experienced in healthcare. And also that you also walk away with sort of a nice definition of human factors that allows you to be an advocate for human factors. To say, hey, maybe we need a human factors person here, maybe we need a human factors perspective, or maybe we need to use some human factors tools on this project. So that's the goal. So I'm going to start having trouble keeping track of all these screens here. How many people do we have on Zoom? Seven people on Zoom. Okay. So I'll still go ahead and ask this question, even though I understand I have a room full of more senior folks. But how many of you have taken psychology classes as part of your training and education? Okay, some of you. So if you've taken psychology classes, even if it's intro psych, which is actually kind of relevant here, you may remember that you studied about a lot of research that took place in the laboratory under controlled experimental conditions. And especially if you took psychology like 10, 20, 30 years ago, that's where like the intro psych textbook would have been. And so that's what we tend to think of when we think of kind of like traditional psychology. Happens in the lab. It includes some core topics like how, the limitations of human memory, attention, workload, et cetera, et cetera. And I'll just point out here for contextual reasons. So I was trained in that kind of environment. So I was actually trained as in a human factors PhD program, but I was trained probably like what somebody may call an experimental psychologist, where I studied how to set up experiments in the lab, how to do fairly complicated, how to make complicated statistical designs and analyze quantitative data. So I don't do that very much anymore. I do a little bit of that, but that's kind of where I started. Okay, so I forgot to ask about this. Am I going to be able to play a video?
Should be.
Okay.
You'd have to probably get out of the slides.
Right, so yeah, exactly.
It's possible that some of you may be familiar with this. Chrome, Explorer.
I think it uses Edge.
Edge.
To the right, Microsoft down a little bit.
To the
To
right.
the right and down.
You just cross.
Oh,
There
this.
you go.
Oh.
Yep.
Okay. I don't use Edge, so I'm like, I didn't even know what icons to look for.
Does this qualify as human factor interaction?
Yes. Yes, it does.
Next.
All right.
No
Oh,
idea.
Not that one.
Not that one. Okay, I didn't mean to get political here. That was not the intention. All right, so. Let's see. It's gonna make a sound. Okay, actually, I don't think we even need sound. We don't have it. Can't see it.
At 12.
14.
No.
All right, how many of you saw the gorilla? Okay, have you seen this video before?
Yeah.
Yes.
You cheated them.
Thanks for playing along.
Okay, I apologize for the people on Zoom. You can go to this link and watch the video yourself, but now you know sort of what happens. So this is an example of, it's called selective attention test. And this is an example of inattentional blindness. So selective attention allows us to filter out irrelevant information around us and helps us focus on things that we want to focus on, things that demand our attention. And of course, I can imagine we can all think of lots of different kinds of applications in the real world, in everyday life and in healthcare where this is applicable too. So
people on Zoom could see the video.
yeah. So that's of course an adaptive, that's something very adaptive as part of our human cognition. But there's the flip side of the coin is this inattentional blindness. That if you're very focused on one thing, you tend to miss the other things that are going on, even things that see in retrospect are incredibly, incredibly obvious. Yes.
There's at least one study where they tricked radiologists. They put a gorilla in the CT scan picture and the minority caught it. And again, you're looking for things you're looking for.
Mm-hmm.
So it's horribly relevant to healthcare.
Yeah, so that's a really great healthcare example. In everyday life, if you're driving a new route and you're looking for which exit you need to take, you might miss pedestrians on the side of the highway or a car making a maneuver that you should be paying attention to. So it's sort of like, it's two sides of the same coin. One side is adaptive and the other side is where things can potentially break down in the real world. So I did pull up this, if anyone's particularly interested in this is a pretty recent study on this phenomenon. All right, so let me talk about some other examples. So this is a pretty classic example in psychology. I mean, this is the type of example that a professor may show, just like I'm showing in this lecture, a professor may show in the intra-psych class. And there are other things that you may have heard of and that you may talk about actually in your training or in the way that you train other clinicians. One of those things is heuristics and biases, for instance. So I'm sure you have all heard of confirmation bias. It plays out pretty strongly in healthcare. It's a tendency to look for information that is consistent with your initial hypothesis and ignore information that's not consistent. And so just like this example of selective attention versus inattentional blindness, there's also kind of two sides of the same coin. We have heuristics, and these are adaptive cognitive shortcuts that we use to make decisions in chaotic real world environments, in dealing with a lot of information. So most of the time, they are going to work. Most of the time, the mechanism that's behind confirmation bias, it's going to work because it's an adaptive technique, except when it doesn't. And that's when we have problems. That's when we have errors. That's when we have vulnerabilities in the system. And when it doesn't work, it's called a bias. But essentially, heuristics and biases are the same mechanism. When it works, it's a heuristic, and when it doesn't work, it's a bias. You may have heard about magical number 7 ± 2. This is based on a really famous study by George Miller. I believe it's like 1956. he found through laboratory experiments, he found that short-term working memory capacity is approximately 7 ± 2 units of information. There's a caveat there. So it actually refers to chunks of information. So as you build expertise in whatever area, you are able to chunk information together in meaningful units. So to somebody who has less experience in a particular domain, they're not gonna be able to chunk information, or the information is gonna be comprised of small units of information, versus somebody who is an expert. They're gonna be able to build bigger chunks and therefore remember and manage larger information amounts. And I think there's some famous studies that you may have heard around this, like one of them is, I think, runner memorizing like running times and having some kind of extraordinary memory capacity. And the basis of having that memory capacity is that he was chunking larger pieces of information because they were meaningful to him, versus just someone else. It's just like gibberish, it's meaningless numbers. We have the concept of priming, and don't worry, I'm not gonna keep going over this. These are just examples of things you may have heard of. Priming is that you know, if I talk to you about my pet dog, and then I have an activity that has to do with, you know, giving some examples of stories from your life, I would have primed you to think about dogs. So as stimulus primes you, makes you think of other things that are related. And then lastly, you may have heard of Gestalt principles, a whole is greater than the sum of its parts, which are used to describe the mechanism of how our perception functions and how it pulls information together. So actually, in the background of the slide, this is an example of like continuity. You know, we have a bunch of circles, but when you put them together, it looks like there's a continuous form that's emergent. So why am I telling you about this? I'm telling you about this. One, this is referred to as microcognition, and that's what we generally study in intro psych and other psychology classes that you may take as an undergrad. Microcognition is important to the conversation about human factors because it gets at the capabilities and limitations of human cognitive and perceptual system. And in order to even begin to start thinking about how humans function in real world complex environments, we need to understand these basics. And you know, a great deal of research went into building this set of principles and set of understanding these mechanisms about human cognition. So let me just give an example, for instance, that applies magical number plus or minus 7. So if you're designing a human interface, for instance, EHR, you need to be aware that people can only process so many buttons or units of information at a time. So if you're giving, yes, I know, right? That's why we have a very active research program at Georgetown focusing on EHR usability, because nobody was really concerned about that on the front end. And now we have a lot of different problems. So anyways, so that's something to keep in mind. A human's not going to be able to manage in a reasonable amount of time all these buttons, all of these pieces of information. Your workload is going to go up. And it's going to be frustrating, and it's going to be error prone. And in complex real world environments like healthcare, nuclear power, aviation, different military applications, you know, errors, they cost lives, they cost money, in addition to all these other kinds of things. So any questions before I start moving into kind of the meat of the conversation. So that's where I wanted to begin to build a story. So important to understand the psychology that we've been studying in the laboratory for decades. Okay. So let's start with a simple example. So imagine this is how you're getting to work. So how do you get to the second floor of this building? It's a mess, right? I mean, clearly, whoever designed this interface didn't take any psychology classes as an undergrad. So this is a fairly simple example. It's a low consequence example, right? This is an example that's intended to demonstrate the frustration and the confusion that we are all familiar with when we're confronted with examples of tools in everyday life that don't have in mind the humans that are intended to use them. So then you get to work. And so in many work cultures, and historically in healthcare and other complex domains, we see the single individual as a source of error and as a target for blame. And we see this shifting, but not enough. But this is how we tend to think about what's going on with human performance. And sure, we talked about all of these limitations that humans have, that humans are fallible. But many who study human performance in complex environments will actually argue that there's no such thing as human error, that there's just poor systems or poor systems design or lack of consideration for the human that is working within the system. But you don't do that in a silo. You work in the context of all of these different things, in the context of complex systems. And the complex systems are comprised of, as you know, of other individuals that are working alongside you in collaboration with you. You're dependent on the things that they do, and they're dependent on you. It's comprised of tools and technologies. You have the HR, you have lots of different tools built into the HR, you have different tools that you're using outside of the HR, other decision support tools that are perhaps thrown at you without really understanding of how they fit in your workflow. And then you have the layout of your physical spaces. So not just kind of the architectural design, but also the placement of furniture, of carts, of beds, or whatever it may be. So basically it's everything, anything and everything. You're working in the context of that. And so human factors provides the systems lens to think about that. And so we refer to that as macro cognition. So it's considering that the human is not just working in a silo in a laboratory under tightly controlled experimental conditions, that the human is working in these complex domains, and you cannot study human cognition, perception, behavior without the consideration of the complexity that they're part of. And so it doesn't mean to say, and we can go back and talk about this more, that you have to understand every aspect of these complex domains and all the factors and all the interactions between those factors. But it means that we have to appreciate that they exist, and we have to appreciate what we don't understand. So in complex systems, the kind of the frustration and confusion that we talked about with this elevator example, in complex systems, the consequences are human lives and money, care delays, medication errors, harm, etc. And macrocognition is interested in looking at cognitive adaptation to complexity of real world environments. It's getting out of the laboratory. And why do we need to get out of the laboratory? Because we can't bring this complexity into the laboratory. It's just simply not possible. So we have to think about how else to study it. And so we have to study this work in the context that it takes place in. And macrocognition is described by all these characterizations of complex environments, uncertainty, dynamic situations, planning and replanning, managing risk, communication, coordination, teams, whatever it is you're doing, that's sort of under the umbrella of macrocognition. And so under that umbrella, we study about how humans make decisions, how they think, how they attend to information, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's why we're having this conversation today. And so all of these principles of microcognition, yes, they're relevant because we still know humans have these limitations in how we think, in how we process, in how we behave. And then on top of all of that, they're doing all these things in really complicated environments. Any questions? So let me step back for a moment for a little bit of history. So where did human factors come from? So it came from military applications, as you may have guessed. So during World War II, Air Force scientists noticed that changes in cockpit design impacted how humans make decisions and how they think about their work. And in fact, that can have disastrous effects on their performance. So basically, the representations and the interfaces that humans use impacts how they think about things. And that's sort of something that I remind myself in my head since graduate school. You know, the way that information is represented in front of you impacts how you think. So basically, when these cognitive and perceptual capabilities and limitations were not aligned with the cockpit design, pilots were more likely to make errors. And so they started to consider these human factors as part of design in service of informing safety and risk reduction. And so this insight led to a new science called human factors psychology and engineering that was applied to the design and evaluations of systems, products, interventions, anything. And so this is the reason why a lot of the human factors work for many years was focused in military applications. So I went to graduate school at Wright State University. A lot of people have not heard of that school, but it used to be the biggest human factors psychology program in the US. And part of the reason for that is because we were located right next door to the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And that's where human factors was born. So we had a very nice relationship with Wright-Pat, where a lot of the PhD candidates and graduates from our program would work at Wright-Pat. I will also say, because I forgot to mention this in the beginning, Wright State also had a human factors engineering program, and that was part of the School of Engineering, and we were not connected in any way. Most human, that does not make sense. That still continues to this day, and it does not make sense. So most human factors people that you will meet with a master's or most people will have a master's or a PhD, they either come from psychology or they come from engineering. And we're slightly different. And as you can imagine, so like this is why I had the psychology examples. That's my background. An engineer is going to have a more engineering background. Now, out in the world, does it impact the work that we do? Sure, that impacts kind of that we bring to the table, but we are all kind of intertwined with one another to the point of where most people don't even realize what background we have. So just FYI. Okay, so more recently, the last 25 years, there's been a very specific shift from the majority of work in human factors being in military applications to healthcare. And so part of the reason for that is the seminal Institute of Medicine report that was published in 1999 to Air as Human. And now this is kind of a very tired example in human factors, because every single one of us who is human factors adjacent or human factors person have like cited the freaking IOM report a million times at this point. Everyone's tired of it. But that's the
And
history.
yet we haven't learned a damn thing.
We have not learned a damn thing. That is absolutely true. We are 25 years since the report. So this is a quote I like. It's not from the report, but it's related to the report. So what did the report say? So in my human factors class, I assign chapters 3 and 4 of the report in my human factors class for master's and PhD students in health informatics. I assign chapters 3 and 4 of the IOM report because those are the ones that are primarily focused on human factors. And basically the point is in the report, to make progress in patient safety, we need human factors as a critical lens. And so as a function of that report, we sort of began the shift with a lot of people that had traditionally done research in aviation shifting into healthcare, and a lot of new trainees actually being trained in healthcare, in human factors healthcare domains. And one of the big areas where a lot of really wonderful human factors researchers and practitioners have come from is UW-Madison. Dr. Scanlon knows of the program, and Megan, Dr. Liddell knows of the program. So some of my like wonderful collaborators and colleagues and friends have come from that program. And now a lot of them have moved over to Indiana University, Bloomington. So I think that's going to be the new hub, or at least I'm excited about that because that's my alma mater. Anyways, so that's what the IOM report kind of screamed this call to action that we need human factors in healthcare. And so people started moving over. And so this quote from Lucian Leap, a few years after the report: healthcare desperately needs your involvement and your expertise to learn how to tease apart our complex systems, to redesign them using basic human factors principles, and to make them work. I think the second part of the quote, I would say that's a lot more complicated than it appears here, but that's kind of the call to action. And we've been trying to respond, not good enough. So what is human factors? There's a number of definitions that people use. And I actually made like 4 different slides that I moved to back up and then deleted them. And I decided to go with this one for this audience because it's fairly simple. It is a science of studying interactions between the human or humans and all aspects of the real world. How the human interacts with the real world. And the real world is comprised of other humans, tools, technologies, physical spaces, whatever it is, it's in the big pot of what the real world is. I also like to give the definition of the consideration of human cognitive and perceptual capabilities and limitations when designing or evaluating systems. And when I say systems, it could mean anything. It could mean a larger healthcare system, or it could mean, you know, a decision support tool and its interface. But that's kind of at the core of definition. And then this is all in service of improving safety and reducing risk in complex systems where consequences are high. And then in more simple systems, of course, we have like on the other side of the spectrum, we have, you know, human factors being applied to like website design, something simple. You know, those people tend to come into that work maybe with even a bachelor's degree, maybe a master's degree, kind of the world of usability and user experience. And so the goal in that kind of work would be improving the user experience.
Sorry. I was gonna do screenshots for my phone.
I can go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead, yeah. Any questions before we?
Do you find that this is the definition that comes from the psychology angle? And engineers would talk more about the complex systems and how to redesign the systems and focus less on the heuristics and biases of the users?
No.
I did a master's through an engineering program, and in the context of human factors engineering, no, they share that. What's interesting is the engineer's view of safety, I would argue, is arcane and out of touch with leading safety thinkers, but that's for another discussion.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's a good question. I feel like at this point, we're just kind of all intermeshed together. And what I try to do is really present the most basic definition, no matter what audience I'm speaking with, because, sorry, I see your hand, because really, I really want people to walk away being able to be an advocate. So I think giving a simple definition is important in doing that. Yeah.
So as a clinician, I am not human factors, but I work with human factors. And what I've appreciated meeting and going to human factors conferences is there's different buckets of human factors, and some tend to be more engineering heavy, like interface with the IS she talked about. But there's also like physical ergonomics and cognitive ergonomics and kind of different buckets in which tend more towards a psychology or an engineering background. But there's a great overlay of like skills.
Yeah, you're making a really important point here, is because I found that a lot of people assume that it's a very narrow field, and you will find that's what Megan is saying, it's not at all. Like, we do all kinds of things. And I was going to talk about this in the method section, but I'll mention it here. I do tend to feel, I mean, for myself and for many other human factors people around me, that we do have like, there's like a set of tools, of human factors tools that we carry around with us. And so we'll have sort of, depending on the work that we do, I mean, I'm a researcher in academia, so I do have a research focus, and that's where my expertise lies. But as a human factor scientist, I have this human factors toolkit, and I apply it to certain kinds of work, and I use it kind of as a side thrust. And in that toolkit, I would say I have like usability and evaluation methods. And so I will promote those as sort of like, hold on, you can't implement this, you know, and hopefully, you know, I can say that earlier on in the process before somebody even started building a tool, let's get out front of this and understand the work so you can inform the design and then evaluate it. But, and I have a slide here, like doing something is better than nothing. So I tend to be that person who is like, I have a usability toolkit, let's use it. Let's use it, like even doing something little, even applying the system usability scale, which is a validated tool that I don't love, but it's kind of an industry standard. So we all kind of carry that around with us, but the field is quite wide. So if you attend a human factors conference, you'll see that human factors people do all kinds of different work, and it ranges in the spectrum of sort of like very rigorous laboratory science to not, to something that maybe looks very much like anthropology or something like that.
You have a, I'll use the term more scientific definition of the term usability. I mean, it's there's safety and there's intuitiveness, but is it reducing, you know, is it adapting with heuristics? Is it reducing the cognitive load? Is it, you know, I mean, what does the usability mean to you?
What does it mean to me? So many things I want to say here. I'm trying to think of where to start. So I tend to feel like kind of the usability toolkit is something that you apply to systems that are not terribly complex. And if you take like a course on usability, they'll talk to you about 4 E's, 5 E's, however many E's, like efficiency, engagement, enjoyment, things like that. So, and if that's all you're doing with like, so, you know, applying into like website design or something like that, that would be like a very, just like a simple example. When I think of usability, I don't think of safety. I don't think of risk reduction. I don't necessarily think of healthcare. Like if that's all you're doing with a complex system that's within healthcare, then that's far from enough.
I mean, in my mind, I'm thinking
Yeah.
healthcare, so I'm thinking devices.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
Using the device the right way.
Yeah.
using the devices
Yeah.
safely.
And I've got a slide deck where crappy design has led to harm or nearly led to
Yeah.
harm because of lack of usability. And
Yeah.
Epic is exhibit A.
Yes.
I'm serious. Just one of the latest updates, they took labs over a 7-year period and put them in the same column. And I'm like, wait a minute, why don't these results make any sense? It's like, wait, the dates cross nearly a decade. And it was one of their features.
Yeah. So of course you may have heard.
Yes. Yes.
So you may have heard of the article like Death by 1,000 Clicks, which is about EHRs. Obviously there's a lot of conversation about EHRs. Like I said, there is a large research group, MedStar, in Georgetown, that one of their foci is looking at EHR usability. It's a great deal of work. And it is not an area that I work in, but I have awareness of it. We all do. And part of the reason that it is so much work is because it wasn't considered on the front end. And I'll talk about this a little bit more later, but why was it not considered on the front end? It's the same barrier that we have in making progress in improving all kinds of challenges in healthcare, because it takes time, it takes resources, and we want solutions, we want them quick. There's a really nice, actually, blog post of all things that one of the faculty in my graduate program, John Flack, I think I've shared this with you both, wrote about EHRs, and talking about if we really want to get this right, and I think this really applies to everything, that it's not that we think about, just generally think about the users on the front end of designing human-centered EHRs, but that we really need to unpack the problem spaces within, all the different clinical contexts and all the different clinician roles, and really have a deep understanding of the work that people do and the decisions that they make and the needs that they have for their work in their context and in their role. And are we ever going to do that? I mean, no. It's essentially, a lot of people will argue that it doesn't fall under that definition of a wicked problem, but I would say that in many ways it does. So.
I think they try to solve that by the different views, the different roles take up within the healthcare system based on the existing application.
Yeah.
We'll limit, or maybe we won't show you this piece when another person needs to see something. But that's taking a backwards approach.
Yeah.
And I can't tell you how many times I've had a nurse or a pharmacist say, well, why can't you see this? I'm like, what are you talking about? It's not in my view. I mean, it's just, doesn't exist in my world.
Yeah. So, and going back to your question that started this conversation, do engineers have a different definition? Yeah, I try to present the simpler definition. And so in my human factors course, I have my students go to the Human Factors and Ergonomics Society website and look at the definitions there. And I try to get them to think and kind of like write up their own that they feel like, I mean, obviously that's representative of what human factors is, but also something that they kind of own and they can say and they know what it means. So you'll see lots of things, but at the core, is the systems thinking lens and the user across the whole spectrum. That's at the core, no matter what. If somebody doesn't have a definition that includes that, then they don't know what they're talking about. Just quickly wanted to show this multidisciplinary, like I've said, most of us come from engineering and psychology. Design, since you had a presentation on design thinking, I'm sure they probably talked about human factors a little bit. Design thinking in human factors is kind of like a hot and sexy thing now. So all of us are doing like design workshops as part of our human factors work. Some like more senior researchers will say that, oh, you can't do human factors work without incorporating that. You know what, I agree. I use that as part of my work. It is very multidisciplinary.
There are two others that I'm struggling to put them on the same map, which is functional design and decision science.
Okay, so is it my next slide? 2 slides away, I'm going to talk about terminology. And I'm sorry if this is like too basic of a level. Okay, good.
Good.
Okay, good. Okay, and then, okay, and aside from this, and I didn't want to overwhelm, but it's all multidisciplinary. There is like, what other sciences? Computer science, linguistics, cognitive science, anthropology, sociology, just like gets thrown into this pot. And depending on where you come from, you're gonna like fall in different places. Where do human factor scientists work? I actually think this is an important slide, although it's basic. Some of us are in academia. This is not completely traditional. This is a fairly new development, probably in the last 15 years or so. So when I was in graduate school, and I graduated in 2009 with my PhD, most of us were going into industry or into government. And then almost like with that UW group, people were trained to go into academia. And now a lot more people are actually being trained in human factors programs to go into academia. And so how do I make that distinction? So being trained to go into academia, you got to be publishing. And that's actually not the way some of us were trained. And that's why I took a non-traditional route to academia. Like I spent a decade working in industry, and then I went to academia. That's why, even though I've been at this for like 20 years, I'm still an assistant professor because I just like went about it the long way. Hospital systems, more and more hospital systems are hiring a human factors person and hiring human factors teams around them. You may know you have Dr. Joy Rivera at Frodert. Did I pronounce it? Frodert.
Close.
Yes. And so at the Human Factors in Healthcare conference, we actually, for a few years, we would have an annual panel where we would it was called like a healthcare embedded panel. And like, I don't know, 7 years ago, maybe it was like just like a handful of people, and then it kind of started to grow. Very slowly it grew, but it's been growing. So when I was in industry, we did a bunch of projects with Cincinnati Children's. And so they hired us on as consultants, and we were, you know, we were considered that we were doing research. And then as a function of the work that we did with them, they ended up hiring an embedded person. So that was very exciting. Private sector. So there's a lot of, and kind of to your point about usability, there's a whole like other community, which is like the medical device design and user experience community. It's like, it's kind of it's part of the human factors community, but if you're not in that community, you kind of are not like fully aware of what they do. But now, you know, the FDA has requirements about medical device design. And actually there is a medical device track at the Human Factors in Healthcare conference, and FDA comes there every year, and all the people flock to that FDA panel to learn about sort of the happenings and the requirements. And the people that work in those areas, they're very, very familiar with the usability process that's very specifically spelled out. And then, you know, what the FDA is doing to sort of move that forward. I actually, when I was transitioning out of industry, I had an interview with a company that was trying to hire a human factor scientist for their usability stuff. And I'm not knocking them at all, but they told me, we would not hire you for your ideas. We would hire you to follow this process that we have spelled out exactly as it's spelled out. And I was like, okay. But I will never forget that statement. I'm like, I don't understand why you're interviewing me. Like, there's nothing in my CV that would suggest that. That's what I'm trying to do. Anyways. So there are a lot of people actually with bachelor's degrees will like go into that industry and they will get like very rigorously trained to follow that process. And then there's government agencies, like I said, like, you know, I worked with a lot of human factors people that with the Air Force and other government agencies. So that's where we are. Is this my terminology? Yeah, this is my terminology side. I'm not gonna like go into these words, but the reason I have this slide is because you are gonna see so many words being thrown around. If you are not a human factors scientist yourself or a human factors practitioner, I would say you can take most of these words and just call it human factors. The differences between a lot of these terms are very nuanced. And they don't matter unless you are actually doing the work in that area. This is very confusing for people kind of on the outside trying to get their head around the literature. So a lot of things, like you mentioned, decision science, there's cognitive science, there's decision-making science. And part of the problem is that almost like we're sometimes incentivized to develop our own terms. And a lot of them mean the same thing. So just wanted to point that out.
And as an aside, depending on the context of the decision science people, if they're healthcare decision science people, I would argue they don't know the science of decision making largely, as evidenced by the diagnostic error camp. And that's where, sorry, I have to put a plug in for your research.
Yeah.
What Megan and Lisa and I and a team have been doing is blowing up the paradigm, the current paradigm, which to me is not based in human factors engineering at all. And that's probably why in 15 or 20 years, we've made no progress. So.
Yes, and I will talk about that a little bit later, and then we can say more things about that as well. Okay, so I've taken this very long path on purpose. So to go from this, which is how we traditionally think about human performance, to this, we have to put on a systems thinking lens. See, Matt, I finally got there. You were getting worried.
No, I wasn't.
I had an hour and a half, so that's why I was like,
you.
I'm gonna like take a really long route here to make sure that we're, you know, we all got it. And I thought there was lots of trainees, so that's part of the reason too. So human factors is systems thinking. I would say that they're, yes.
But I think you overestimate how much even experts in the healthcare field know about decision-making and processing. I don't think it was that basic.
Okay, yay. So human factors is systems thinking, and do not forget that the human is actually part of that system. And that's why when we talk about biases and magical number 7 plus or minus 2, it matters. Those limitations and capabilities of the human, they matter because that human is part of that system. Okay, so I'm putting this up. This is kind of ugly. This is the type of diagram I and others would have drawn in graduate school. So, so we used to say the human is not working in a silo, the human is performing in a context of all these different things, and, you know, here are examples of some of these things. And it is really the interactions between the human, and that's why you have the double-headed arrows here, the humans and all these different things. They impact how humans do the work and vice versa. And then also you will see that it's a feedback system, which is like a very important component of a diagram like this. So that's what we used to do in graduate school. And then some really nice people finally basically published this thing that we used to draw out and didn't have a name for. And that was very exciting. So this is SEEPS 2.0, and it stands for Systems Engineering Initiative for Patient Safety. And this is a framework of system complexity. It is a framework, it is a guide, it is intended to be flexible and adaptable, it is intended to be challenged. If you don't like something, say it doesn't belong. If you feel like something's missing, do some research and add that component. If you feel like something is not unpacked enough, do some research and unpack it. It is intended to be challenged. It is intended to be a guide for conducting research in complex domains. A guide to make sure that you say, I understand this work is taking place in a complex system. And maybe my current study is looking at these components. And, you know, but all of this stuff, all this other stuff is still happening. Maybe we're not unpacking it as part of this study, but it's all still here. And that's part of how you characterize complex systems. And then so we have the work system here, and I want to highlight that there was the first version of SEEPS, just called SEEPS. This is SEEPS 2.0. The main difference between the two of them is that, amongst a couple of other differences that I'm not going to go into, is that as part of the work system, we have the human at the center, human and humans teams. And for the first version of SEEPS, we had the clinician at the center. And for SEEPS 2.0, we have the patient alongside the clinician at the center of that system. That was a really actually very critical shift in human factors in general, because we started to also focus on not just clinician work, but patient work, and how patients, and some focus on how patients and clinicians interact, and also an additional field that actually just focuses on the patient and the work that they do within and outside of clinical settings. So that was a critical move, and now we actually have a subfield in human factors called patient ergonomics. So we have the work system and we have the components, and like I said, we are free to unpack these components. We have the processes that take place. We have the clinician work. We have the collaborative work between patients and clinicians, and then we have just patient work. That's why we have this distinction here. And then we have the outcomes. And then we have the feedback loop, which is very critical. And at the core of the work system is that we have all you can imagine, these are like double-headed arrows, the interactions between the humans and all the other components of the system. Oh, okay. So at this point, this is what, 2013, so over a decade old. And this has been applied quite heavily in human factors and outside of human factors. And, you know, we've had some shifts in the types of research that we focus on, including a lot of areas that we've kind of left by the wayside that we should be continuing to focus on, like diagnostic error and shift handoffs and things like that. But SEEPS 2.0 has been applied to research in health disparities, on vulnerable populations, on disabilities. I was working with some students who applied it to nutrition and well-being, breastfeeding, and other health and wellness topics that are more current, even though this is over a decade old. So if you go to a human factors conference, you will see all of that kind of conversation. And so in the publication, the promotion of this, sort of on the heels of the IOM report, has served as a really important vehicle to move forward the science of patient safety. But not enough, not enough. Anything else, Matt, do you want to add to SEEPS 2.0?
The one thing you didn't explicitly say that I will say just for completeness,
Yeah.
this is called a sociotechnical system, which is jargon. Socio, people, technical, everything that's not a person. And the reason that's important is, and I hear this still, not on a daily basis, but regularly in clinical environments, oh, it's a people problem or a systems problem. And maybe you've even said that. That to me is perfect, because then I know they don't know what they're talking about. Because in healthcare, every system is a socio-technical system, which means up there, people are an integral part, and it's a false dichotomy to separate those two. And I think, again, that we're not going down the rabbit hole of why patient safety has failed, as much as I love to talk about that. But part of it is because we've acted like the person's in a vacuum, and it's in the system is everything else.
How does organizational culture and individual cultures play into that?
It's interesting. I've talked about writing this paper for years, and I'm really bad about writing my own papers. Orphanage of papers. When I've talked, so that one of the lead authors on this is Pascal Carrion, who's now retired, but she was the driving engine in Madison. I will say as a footnote, I think their program is imploding. Which is really sad to me, because they were so great and did amazing work. And now they're into, for all I know, they're going to do AI next.
Yeah.
Gluten-free and AI included. Sorry, it's probably in my. And when I talked to Pascal about it, my bias is it's in every one of those components. And one of the issues is if you think about people, like even the people in this room, we all bring our own culture. So we're having our own culture, and often it's a clash of those cultures. My favorite analogy is, are there any surgeons or anesthesiologists here before I?
Say it.
Okay.
It's not like something.
Well, no, it's just, the joke is, the drape is the blood-brain barrier, and
Right.
which side is which. And, you could have identical twins train, and by the time they're done, one's an anesthesiologist, one's a surgeon, and they have different worldviews because of their cultural experience. And so Epic has their culture, and that is imprinted on their technology. And a group of us, including Joy Rivera, used to go to Madison and or Verona and try and change their thinking. We actually brought them to Children's to tour, these 23-year-old engineers who were horrified by what they were seeing. And we lost. Culture eats everything. So I think it's in every one of those. And that's why my favorite phrase about healthcare is it's messy. And it's because of that. I don't know. Lisa, what do you think?
I completely agree with that. And first of all, we do have this component of organization. So, we could have a conversation about if we were all to kind of place culture, where would we place it? Would we just would it be an overarching thing? Would it fit in under each component? And also, what does culture mean? You have the culture of your organization, you have the culture of your unit, you have the culture of your profession, and then you have other cultures that are external to that, including multinational culture. And actually, I forgot to mention this, and that's not actually the culture that I was going to talk about, but one of the new area of research is including the cultural background as part of this model, which was not something that was originally discussed. But I think culture and unpacking what it means, and it means so many different things, is really important add to this model. So yes, I completely agree with what you said, and I completely agree that this is like something that's explicitly missing, because you do, you know, that's such a big bucket that you do want to sit, you want to have that somewhere in the model.
It so heavily influences behavior.
Yes, absolutely.
And I could be wrong about it. I think part of that's Pascal's program was an engineering program. And I think because of that, they were a little more technically influenced than the people component. And maybe that's unfair, but
No, I think you're absolutely right. One of the things, and I actually, so Rich Holden, so Holden was a student of Pascal Carrion. So I want to say that he considers himself, so he got his PhD in the engineering program, but it's also under psychology as well. So he considers himself both. And then a few years ago, they published a paper, like it's like a 10-year review of, it's focused on patient ergonomics, but it doesn't matter because it uses the SEEPS lens. And one of the things that I noted, that it's primarily focused on behavior rather than cognition. And the reason I bring that up, and I'll explain what I mean by that, is I think that it speaks to your engineering point. And so in psychology, when we talk about behavior, that is what's observable. And when we talk about cognition, that's what's in the head, that's how people think. And that's what informs their decisions. So a lot of this research, because it was born under the engineering umbrella, it's like less focused on what's in the head, but more focused on what's observable. And that's a huge gap. And that's a gap that I've been talking about in my own work. And that goes to your point. And if you look at that, because I remember sort of having an inkling that that was what was going on. And I looked at that 10-year review and I'm thinking,
I'm so sorry, I have to sneak out really quick.
Yeah, of
Where's
course.
the it's recorded.
On the CTS side.
It'll be on the CTS site. Perfect, thank you.
I had that inkling that that was the case because of engineering. And I looked at that 10-year review and I'm like, yeah, there's only like maybe 2 or 3 studies that are focused on cognition. And I asked Rich about it. I was like, is that, and he's like, yeah. So that's a gap. And that is a function of engineering, I think. All right. So, and another thing, and I think, okay, barely out of time. No, I forgot what I was going to say. Forgot. Okay, so, yes, actually, in human factors, like 20 years ago, we had like a subfield that was focused on culture, and then it went away. And I don't know where it went. It like got subsumed under other disciplines. And I actually have my PhD student is working on looking at how Nigerian breast cancer patients make decisions. And like I've been talking to her about this. I said, like, we used to go to a human factors conference and there would be not just one session, but multiple sessions focused on culture. And it was mostly multinational culture, but also organizational culture, also like some things from industrial organizational psychology that speak to culture. And now we just don't have that conversation anymore. We need it more than ever. So, really important point about culture. Okay, I think some of you probably have seen this article 2016, which feels like yesterday, but it's almost 10 years ago now. Medical error, the 3rd leading cause of death in the United States. And further, this is even a bigger problem because as we know that many errors go unnoticed, unaccounted for, unreported due to various kinds of reasons, including culture. And then also, and I'm not going to get into this too much, sort of thinking about, errors defined as a process rather than an outcome, and like thinking about not reporting errors that don't lead to harm, which cuts out such a large proportion of data that we should be looking at to unpack this problem space. Whole other conversation that's related. So this is a military example, but this is where we're at. So what's the problem? The problem is that we are throwing technological solutions at problems we do not understand. Technological solutions, they're sleek, they're sexy, use the right terminology, AI. We kind of leverage today's hottest advances to describe them, but if they don't fit the problem, if they don't fit the person, if they don't fit the workflow, they might as well go straight into the garbage. Am I being really extreme here? It's true. I don't know. I grapple with this every day. Yeah.
I feel like I've run into a lot of people that are very like pro AI, but it doesn't take the human out of it because humans design it to put in whatever. So it's still fraught with human problems at the front and the back.
Well, that's the fallacies of healthcare information technology papers.
Yes. And I have that coming up.
We use technology to replace fallible humans. That the technology was designed by fallible humans.
Yeah.
Vicious circle.
Garbage in, garbage out.
Yeah. And so are we not just addressing the problems at hand because we don't understand them, then we have a whole load of unintended consequences that are playing into the problem space as well. So I think we can all relate to this, not just in healthcare and all aspects of our lives. So knowing all of this, why can't we make progress? And so I said there are many reasons, but one of the reasons is that it takes time and effort and patience and money and people to do good work, to do good research, spend the time understanding problem spaces so the findings can inform solutions that are truly human-centered. And when I say human-centered, that means that they fit the needs of the user and fit the types of problems and challenges that the user is having in the environment that they're having those problems in. So people don't like that. People want solutions and they want them quick. And that's human nature. So this is another quote that I really like. Karsh is a former collaborator of Dr. Scanlon. This is one of my favorite articles. Health Information Technology Fallacies and Sober Realities, published in 2010, 15 years ago. I would say that every single aspect of this stands true today, if not more today than before, because we have even more technology happening, more technological advancements. So we can't develop and implement effective solutions if we do not understand what the problems are, if we don't understand the lived experiences and perspectives and the needs of those who need them, in addition to also understanding that microcognition piece of how humans think and perceive. So what do we do? And I think all of us in this room, are in a position to take a little step forward in doing something. So first of all has to do with asking the right questions and then using the appropriate methods to ask those questions, to answer those questions. And so the right question, again, is not what people want, but what they need based on what they do. Oh my gosh, I'm going really slow. So let me speed up a little bit. Methods. So I think of human factors as a toolbox. Many of the human factors methods are adopted and adapted from other fields because human factors, now it's getting in a more established field, but it's still not that many decades old. A lot of methods come from anthropology because they had nice refined field research methods, and we borrowed a lot of them and adapted for our own needs. I do want to highlight here because this is a common challenge that people have. just because I'm using observations and interviews in my research, and an anthropologist, in a building down the street, and a sociologist and someone else, doesn't mean we're doing the same work. Because based on our perspective, we are asking different types of questions, and we are looking through the responses with a different lens. So that's really important to remember, because I've heard people say like, oh, well, I don't need so-and-so to do interviews because I've got this other person. Well, they're not doing, they're not bringing the same perspective to the problem space. No matter what methods you're using, people are at the center from start to finish, which is, I actually even don't like to put this up in a way because you're never really finished. You're always refining, but people. And then if you're looking at like kind of an overview level human factors chapter, you may see a graphic sort of like this. Now this doesn't negate SEEPs. You can use this cycle using a SEEPs lens. And I don't know if I mentioned or not, you can use SEEPs 2.0 with any method. That's what's so nice about it. It's a guide and you use whatever method. So you may see this type of cycle, understand with slightly different words, understand, design, evaluate, and implement. Understand is the research piece. And it has to start on the front end to do the problem space justice if you're really working with a complex problem space. And it is kind of an iterative cycle. You actually are understanding all the way. You start understanding through the front end, from the front end, and then you continue to engage the target users, the target humans, all the way like you're evaluating the design. And I will go back to your usability comment. A lot of people will use usability as like a category for any kind of evaluation. And what's in that pot, somebody may or may not define as usability evaluation. So that's the cycle that you may see. And then methods. And I've kind of divided them up into these different stages in the cycle. Focused on field cognitive research methods. So in my research, I tend to use a lot of observations and interviews as opposed to what I kind of was trained to do is doing experiments. And then this is probably like the stuff that you heard in the design thinking presentation, and then with like prototypes and concepts and prototypes, the big pot of whatever type of evaluation methods you use under that umbrella of usability, which really should include both subjective and performance metrics, which is really, really important, especially with complex problem spaces. Example projects. So this is the exciting part. So this is this wonderful team, which is comprised of more people than are just pictured here, that I work with, and I'm really grateful to be a part of. And thank you to Dr. Scanlon for pulling us all together. I feel like it's been really such a pleasure to learn from one another. And we are focused on studying diagnostics or diagnostic error in the pediatric ED. And I'm not going to go into a ton of detail here. If any one of you wants to unpack this further, we can do that. So I just wanted to give some examples of the type of work that uses a human factors lens. So in this work, we are at the stage of unpacking the problem space. The work that happens around diagnosis of an attending physician in the ED is super, super complex. There's a lot of stuff going on. And so we are using the SEEPs lens to capture this work using naturalistic observations, and to basically come out with a description to say, oh my God, the clinician is doing such complex work in the midst of such a complex environment. And so really, I'll kind of like stop by saying that, and that's just an example of, and I'm not going to apply the cycle to this particular project because we are in that space of understanding. And sometimes that can take a very, very long time. This is just a little bit of findings I'm not gonna go into them in detail, but you can see here that we're using SEEP's components of tasks, people, tools, and technologies, and we're looking at how many tasks and what tasks and how long are attendings engaged in as they are caring for what we're calling an index patient, one patient. And this is in the context of caring for other patients as well, right? How many people and what types of interactions they're having with these people, how many technologies, tools, and what for, and how and why, and all these things. We're characterizing the complexity of the space. Another healthcare example, this is a project that we recently finished at UIC. This was funded by the National Cancer Network, Pfizer. This was about non-medical switching of a particular medication, breast cancer. I'm going to speed this up. We used all kinds of methods. We used surveys, we used interviews, we used a design workshop. We looked at convergence and divergence between patients and clinicians on their perception of kind of the medication switching situation, their worry, their concerns about effectiveness. And we came out with designing an informational toolkit that's geared towards both oncologists and patients to inform decision-making regarding medical switching. And if I could talk about this project for a very long time, I'm not going to, but basically, again, this is an example of, so where SEEP's here, I could unpack that. SEEP's was a lens, and we collected many sources of information, and through, actually, we had a team comprised of researchers, clinicians, and patient advocates, which was very exciting and informed this type of toolkit. And this is a project that I did when I was in industry, again, using the cycle, using field observations, interviews, design workshops to develop an interface for an unmanned helicopter. This is funded by ONR, Office of Naval Research. This was a very exciting project because the implementation, we were part of a field test and we conducted evaluation of the interfaces that were fielded. Takeaways. So we could say a lot here. Be a human factors advocate. Hopefully you're walking away from this presentation kind of understanding the story behind human factors, the value of human factors, the necessity of the system lens onto complex problem spaces. And remember, I said, it doesn't mean that you have to understand the whole system. It's simply not possible. You have to know that the work is happening within that system and it impacts how humans make decisions within complex systems. Partner with human factor scientists when it's possible, identify when those situations are necessary. You can have a more long-term collaboration. You can bring people in as consultants. Think about human factors partners as part of your teams, as part of your work, as part of your conversations, as part of the education that you are part of, both as an educator and as a recipient of education. And then take part in a culture shift. If you're doing work, you can't partner with a human factors person, but you can say, hey, as part of this work, we need to engage all the stakeholders that hold a stake in this problem space. We need to doing something is better than nothing. We need to be talking with them. We need to be having them, we need to be asking them what's difficult, what's error prone, what I need to support my decision-making, and need to have them be looking at the prototypes that you are developing. So you can be part of that culture shift by calling out in your role, in your position, we need this as part of this project. And then take that time and effort to understand problem spaces, speak up and say, this is going to take longer because we need to talk to people that are doing this work, and we need to know what are they grappling with. So I think that there are many opportunities ranging from, you know, something that doesn't have to cost a lot of money, to, you know, building and forging relationships with human factors partners in operations, in QI, in research, and in just like thinking ahead about the future of healthcare. This is a slide, I'm actually not going to go through it. I use it for students in a master's program in our department that are not even health informatics students, they're biomedical visualization students, but they work, sometimes they work on apps and they work on tools. And so I like to tell them doing something is better than nothing. Human factors is not part of their training, and I'm trying to change that. So I give them a presentation where I say, hey, you know, you have your app, you didn't engage your stakeholders, okay. Use system usability scale to at least evaluate it. You might see the benefit. Ask people some qualitative questions about what they think about your tool. That's a good place to start. It's doing something that's better than doing nothing at all. And hopefully, as a function of doing something, you will start to see the value of talking to people, with observing their work, with asking them what keeps them up at night. That's it. Whew. Questions, discussion?
Open for question.
Can you go back a couple slides?
Sure.
Keep going. Stop. I would almost argue that understanding is changing in the order here. Understanding, designing, implementing, and then evaluating. Flipping an implementation and evaluation, or adding in a continuous evaluation of the
Yes.
implementation component.
Completely agree with you. Completely agree with you.
It was just an observation. I wanted to
Yes.
get out there.
Absolutely. Yes. Always understanding, always evaluating. Don't be implementing before evaluating in any situation.
I thought you were gonna say PDCA or PDSA.
No, and the problem I see on the front lines, and what I learned from Benzie Karshu, he's a reference. When I was a safety officer at Children's for 5 years, I used to call Benzie and say, Benzie, how would you approach this problem we're having? He'd say, I don't know, Matt, I have to go study it. That was always his answers. And we don't do that diligence. We jump to solutions all the time. Everybody comes to the meeting with what their favorite pet solution is, and then it's which tribe wins today. And the irony is we never diagnose the problem and understand what's going on with our systems of care delivery. But I agree with you, it's iterative design throughout the life cycle.
And we do have the arrows here, just FYI. But you know, your comment, you know, this is actually not my graphic, and maybe I'll make my own graphic because I completely, it's iterative, and you always understand, and evaluation is part of understanding.
And don't you adapt this to the problem? I mean, you can't make 50 helicopters, but you can make 50 versions of an app. So you can go through this more rapidly and spend less time on some of the others.
Yes.
Right?
So the idea is that if you are doing the front end work, like with understanding the problem space and then also evaluating low fidelity prototypes, not when you already have the app, but when you have like a paper version, even if it's a sketch, you should be starting to put it in front of users, even 1 or 2 or 3. Then by the time you get to like a higher fidelity prototype, you're gonna have a more human-centered tool. And again, by human-centered, I mean, it's gonna better fit the problem, the user, etc. Versus in many situations, more often than not, because that type of thinking is not applied at the front end, by the time you get to that evaluation stage, you don't have the time or the money to make any significant changes. And then you just move forward with a thing that you designed in the first place without understanding the user or the problem.
Lisa had this brilliant idea for the research that we're doing in the ED, where we wanted a data collection tool to try and capture lots of stuff happening in the wild, and we didn't feel right to go into clinical spaces with it to evaluate. So Lisa suggested we go to a coffee shop and did observations of the baristas working as if that was and it iteratively informed the design of the tool just by being creative and thinking, okay, well, it's not the ED, but we can test whether this would fly.
Like there's still lots of interactions, there's still lots of
Mhm.
tasks, there's
Yeah.
still a lot of technology. There's all the components that we have in healthcare in a different way, but it allowed us to play with it and figure out how the tool worked and how the tool did it before we took it into the actual.
Yeah, and it addresses so many issues, including the logistical barriers in the time that you have to spend waiting for like the right permissions, approvals, whatever it may be, where you can still continue on with your work if you find like a proxy that you can sort of,
Prototype, so to speak.
yeah.
The other thing I'm learning in the infancy of my research career, as I'm watching in tandem my other coworkers do their research careers, is I'm realizing that human factors can really help border with any project you have. And Matt has taught me that healthcare wasn't designed, it just kind of came about. And I'm starting to realize that I think we're at a juxtaposition. Like there's a lot of innovation happening in healthcare, but to actually put that into delivering it to patients, I think we're going to need human factors because we've got such a complex system. Patients don't even understand sometimes the treatments we're giving to them, let alone like talking about 3 other treatments. And you know, I've learned a little bit with Lisa with her work with breast cancer, even helping people make those decisions. And I feel like the more we target towards individual patients, the more complex that's going to get, the more collaborators and the more consultants that we have, everything is just going to continue to get more complex. And unless we are very intentional with the design, I don't think our research is going to have the benefit in the wild that we hope it's going to have, unless we're intentional with how we implement it.
That's such an important point that you're making. And this makes me think of an interview that I was just doing last week with a breast cancer patient who just had a mastectomy. And she happened to be a nurse who has at least like 15 years of practice under her belt. And she said, she's like, this is really embarrassing, but I don't really understand like what like kind of procedure I had. Like not specific, she knew what it was called. You know, and I was like, wow, if she's a nurse and she doesn't understand, and she was like very articulate, very knowledgeable, was able to speak to all of like using clinical terminology, but she said, I just didn't really understand. She's like, I'm still figuring it out. And I was like, whoa, that was such an eye opener.
I mean, as far as systems are concerned, the complexity problem, I think we're trying to cram everything into one system, and that's gotta add to the probably there's a direct correlation between how complex you make a system and how much the interaction satisfaction deteriorates with the system. Like Epic could be a good example. It's like all in one, everyone uses the same thing. There's 20 different ways to do the same thing. But you add complexity and you keep losing the human interaction part of it or the simplicity of it.
The other issue, just to add on to that, is between trying to protect patient information. So these are all very well intentioned, very well. I'm not knocking them in any way, shape, or form, but like with the use of HIPAA and with the use of the IRB and with all of the different oversights, it's created barriers to take research out of the clinical domain and put it in the lab. And then we talk about work as imagined instead of work as done. And so quality improvement, a lot of that is born in work as, so we talk about the system. We take up this giant whiteboard, we write it all out, but we don't actually understand how it's being delivered because we're not in the space it's being delivered in. And so I do feel like there's also kind of critical juncture to like put people who are doing this research like in the environments to actually study how it's done with the people that are doing the work. And I also feel like there's a huge gap between those who design the system. The way healthcare has become such a multi-headed hydra, there are people that are controlling the organization that are so far removed from the deliverers of the system. I feel like, and I feel like human factors could work as that bridge between the work as done and the work as imagined. And we've talked, I mean, people in our research are like, yeah, we talked about this, but I feel like that's a missing component in a lot of work that's being done.
Well put. Well, I was thinking the same way. When we talk about healthcare systems, how come leadership and management are not involved and they're not getting exposed to the tools and the frameworks that are part of human factors engineering and a few other related disciplines, right? But you also pinpointed something that is extremely important to us, which is how do we design research? Because in our model of pre-ensemble and ensemble team science is trying to capitalize exactly on this. We need to bring sometimes, how do I bring 3 clinicians from 3 different subspecialties that may be designing this project together? Rarely you may have a statistician and epidemiologist, but it kind of ends there.
Right.
And you don't have the right capabilities to actually start from scratch,
Yeah.
designing the project
Yeah.
that will be fruitful later on.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point, and it's like, I get very frustrated, or in the last few years, I've gotten additionally frustrated because we don't talk about logistical challenges in design and execution of research projects in our publications. And we're all like struggling in various ways due to different organizational issues, logistical issues, and we are not even learning from one another because it's not traditional for us to say like, oh, I grappled with this type of logistical issue or this type of a delay. And so we're kind of like all reinventing the wheel and doing the same thing all over again and struggling. And I think that's really frustrating. Like personally, I try to like incorporate those things in the things that I write up, and I try to ask those questions of my fellow researchers. And I think that's part of the culture shift. And that also applies, I know we're not talking about this here, but like to the design of clinical trials as well, because that's, I mean, that's research. So again, my student is working on human-centered clinical trials. And part of what we're talking about is not just like the clinical trial aspect of it, but like designing research that fit the participants and their challenges, you know, like ranging from things like trust that could be a barrier to enrollment to just like the ability to show up to extra appointments because transportation and cost and childcare and things like that. So there's that whole other, like, that's a whole like other space that's so important, and there's so many different layers to it.
Fantastic presentation and
Thank you.
discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your attention and your really wonderful questions.